I was in the Hunt Library of Carnegie Mellon University one afternoon 20 some years ago. And I came across a handbook for applying for work at the Central Intelligence Agency. And it was bona fide. It was on the new book rack. And somewhat to my surprise, it went out of its way to be a stereotype of the sort of thing I despise about them. It opened with, if you're called upon to lie to your wife, your children, your friends, etc., would you do that? I thought, well, the CIA is a lie machine. But don't get me wrong. There are situations where it's wiser not to tell the truth. Many people in Hitler's Germany were Judased by the truth. An example, if you're hiding Anne Frank in your closet and the Gestapo say, is Anne Frank in your closet? You say, no, sir. And they go on their merry way because they believe you. So Anne Frank gets another day in hiding. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about is what's meant by living in truth and what sort of ethical decisions have to be made to live in truth. It's not really that complicated. If you stake out your territory to being a journalist, then you wear your pursuit of truth on your sleeve. It's an ethical calling when it comes to telling the truth. And I knew Martha Gellhorn. And one of the things that this conversation is going to discuss is what evidence do we have that Martha Gellhorn was operating on misinformation when she made decisions after communicating with me? And what do those decisions mean and say about forces impinging on her awareness of the situation? That's Greg Carl would put it. Well, I also want to talk about Hollywood, particularly Clint Eastwood. So there was an old television show called Maude. You could argue that Maude was sort of the person who would look up to Martha Gellhorn. In one of the programs, she spent talking about how alienating and toxic masculinity was, machismo, men standing hovering over you with their macho, thinking they're all big, their native authority, etc. At the end of the program, the doorbell rings and John Wayne is at the door. Maud melts into his arms. Oh, Mr. Wayne. Well, Martha was married to Ernest Hemingway. She was the sort of person who would say, I think you have the wrong house, to John Wayne. Martha would sleep with men who went to the front. She was an army man's babe. She said they weren't going to live very long, and it meant so much to them, and it meant so little to me, when she gave herself to them. But what they were doing meant the world to her. She stood with them, stowed away alongside of them, risked her life. So at some point in Martha's career, long before she became undesirable, she stopped sleeping with American soldiers. How do you explain this? What she told me about America was that it was a large island of self-absorbed dummies. What I read about it, she said nothing good will come from all that ignorance. She was a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. She corresponded dearly loved friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. They lived together in the White House for a while. She flew off to Spain. The first night of travel, wrote, "Come ahead, Adolf." Army men look for women who recognize their valor. They say women love a man in uniform. Well, that spoke for Martha in World War II. She loved the man in uniform. She was a firebrand in her own right. And she hated Nazism. So what changed? Well, Army men long for the days when things weren't so complicated. World War II veterans, 100 years old, one of them wept on camera, trying to make sense of the world. Now, I've had problems with Hollywood. I challenged Reagan at the Pet News to be more open about what was going on, more compassionate in his decisions. And so he evidently sent Clint Eastwood after me. You know, he came out with a Secret Service movie, and if you check my medical records, he was asthmatic in that movie. They used a secret weapon on me. It was the first time I ever had asthma. This season I've been particularly bad. For a long time I didn't have it. But the girl, the hottie they sent to come on to me from Trump Industries with the Beatles, used to say, "Take my breath away." They poisoned me in the mouth. Mark Gellhorn and I talked about the AIDS being an attack. She said, "You mean somebody would deliberately give that to someone else? You can't mean that." But she saw the liberation of Dachau. So she was not a naive person. She was very direct with me about this. But she seemed to believe it was something Reagan would never do. What if she was wrong? She took her life on 217, a signal for two virgins. What if she was wrong to endorse that crowd? What if, like Alan Dulles deceiving Eisenhower, she was one of the intimates to Queen Elizabeth who the British were deceiving? I know she was uncomfortable with overpopulation, but she would only be willing to scare me with Hollywood scare tactics if she didn't believe somebody was actually going to poison me. It's contemptible to think that Martha Gellhorn would deliberately poison somebody. You may think, well, I was aversive to going into Grenada or El Salvador. So was she. Nobody Judas her friend General Foucher, who Churchill considered a man of conscience. But he was a French conscience in Prague. He took off his French general's uniform and doffed the Czechoslovakian commoner's uniform. And the Gestapo didn't know who they had at the end of the war when they locked him up. Or they would have killed him right away. He survived World War II. Nobody Judased him. The countless people could have told the truth and gotten a pat on the head. Now, over time, I've looked into the fact that D.D. Allen appears in Serpico and have come to the conclusion that Hollywood Gestapo have been running a snuff ring. Why would Clint Hill be indexed to Clint Eastwood? Why would Clint Eastwood be party to poisoning somebody, to killing the Kennedys, if in fact he was involved with D.D. Allen? May not like hearing this, but this is servicemen. They need someone to live up to. believe hey, someone to look up to. And many people have tried to live up to Clint Eastwood. Nobody tries to live up to Clint Eastwood like Clint Eastwood. And maybe he took his own enigma a bit too far. Martha was featured on a U.S. postage stamp back in the days when you could really admire the U.S. postage stamps policies. They only honored people who had been deceased for 6 or 7 years. They only honored people who were from the United States. Bill Gates and his Confederacy have changed these rules, much to my own personal dismay. It may have been bitterly intentional and personal for them to do that. Trump is that kind of man. And all of these people somehow heard about me. What I wonder ultimately about Martha is what she really thought happened, what she knew, and what she would have said if she understood the full scope of what I learned on Mount Desert Island and in Tacoma. Martha would not have stood with somebody who was extolling the virtues of Goebbels. Goebbels was being extolled by Wilhelm Brown. Wilhelm Brown was from the Northern forests of the Gurdjieff Society, where Walter Hodorowski was involved, who I met at Claymont to the invitation to Claymont of Robert Fripp of King Crimson. So that's just a hop, skip, and a jump when you pour on milk. In other words, Fripp had no problem using a symbol of Nazi Germany to promote his ire towards me about something that I personally believe never even happened. And certainly I knew nothing about. It's a stretch to believe that Martha Gellhorn would have endorsed all that. It's an obscenity to believe that she would have endorsed poisoning somebody. And yet these people in their mayhem think nothing of it at all. It is a gross insult to believe that Martha Gellhorn would side with somebody who was promoting Goebbels because she believed he was ideologically correct. And yet, the county of Allegheny, King County authorities, Seattle Mental Health, ad was, and evidently the police department all over in the United States of America, certainly the Obama machine, sided with this nut job promoting Joseph Goebbels because they said that someone, namely me, had slept with somebody they objected to. And it was their business. Why? Because they made pornographic films of it in secret. Oh. And they want the money from licky jobs. Oh. They told Martha, hey, he ain't even investigating a Venus flytrap entrapment ring now. And somehow, somewhere along the way, somebody explained two virgins pussy ball to her. She said, well, I am offended by Jimmy's being upset about Leslie and his possessiveness. Did they tell her that a neurotoxin causing brain reaction was being used on a deaf person who'd been beaten half to death? Just the opposite. They said all kinds of lies. They went by a script that was done by Manson. So she didn't know what was going on. She trusted the Israelis a little too much. A lot of people knew that about her. And Cyril Wecht evidently sold his story. And this was long before the museum heist emerged from Cyril Wecht's little circle of thieves. I always found it ironic that John Schulman should be so associated with Cyril Wecht and be ripping off the museum because Wecht is the one who reported Kennedy's brain missing. And these people come from a Frankenstein crowd who lived with Boris Karloff in the Dakota mansion. and got a dude Van de Graaff generator named Wattenmaker. To get little boy, what else's brain are they after? That's what I wonder. Tav used to talk about pulling people's brains out of their hats. Is that what you're after, Gates? Is that what you're after, Trumpy Tune? The brain that's under McCreary's hat? Don't put it past Yoko Ono. She's avenging Hiroshima. Martha Gellhorn would not have gone along with such a farce. But she was the type of person who might have been intoxicated by the pan pipes of Mother Nature's Englishmen. Sir Paul.